I'm Terry Malik.
And I'm Jared Treadway, and we're inviting you to co-create with us.
From our home base in North Central Texas.
We're hosting conversations that nourish our mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual intelligence.
We are about being spiritually physical.
And physically spiritual.
We are about inspiration.
And aspiration.
We are about involution.
And evolution. We're about self-exploration
and self-excavation. We are about each of us coming to know ourselves in our fullness and wholeness,
so that together we serve the expansion of human consciousness
with the gifts of our specific genius.
Welcome to 33 North, 96 West.
Greetings, Terry, and welcome to the studio on this cold February morning.
Greetings, Jared. Yes, quite the cold front coming in.
Yeah, we're finally starting to feel like winter here in North Texas.
Yes.
So the last time we got together, we discussed self-love. And in the evolution of our conversation, I made a suggestion that discernment was a function of empathy. There was a slip of my tongue. And actually, it kept slipping. I kept using that word, empathy. And in the intervening time between then and now, we've been emailing and we had a production meeting. And the idea of empathy is next for us to discuss, chew on, digest, and discern. What's this empathy thing?
I just want to highlight, to start with, the difference between sympathy and empathy. Without going into great detail, just a highlight of that, because I do often experience the words used maybe interchangeably as if they're synonyms. But sympathy involves an understanding from your own perspective. So if I say that I sympathize with somebody for their circumstances or their situation, what I'm really doing is I am putting myself in a position to think of how it would impact me. If I had that experience, how would it impact me? And then my reaction or my behavior is going to be connected to that. And I'll even go kind of a little step further with an example. Say you're on social media and you see there has been something, a circumstance has been very difficult for somebody. Say it's a loss. And everybody will say, so many different ways that you'll see that expressed from different individuals. But when somebody says, I went through that, I know what you're feeling, they're basically saying, I sympathize with you because I know, I've had that experience and I know how I felt or how I would feel. So it's a very personalized expression of, I'll say, compassion. You're doing what you can to express compassion to this individual, but you are doing it from how you have or would feel from that. Whereas with empathy, it involves putting yourself in the shoes, so to speak, of the other individual. So you're going to kind of see a difference between the energy of these two words and these emotions expressed through the words and through what's being expressed. And the reason I wanted to bring that up, we'll allude to that later. Later, we're going to get into more variables and variations of the word empathy. So let me just leave that there and see what you have to say to lead us in further, connecting back to empathy.
Okay, so to reiterate a little bit about what you said, you've referred to kind of some dictionary meanings of the two words, sympathy and empathy. And I'm going to speak a little bit to the etymology. Sympathy. So sim is the prefix meaning with, and pathy is about feeling. So I'm feeling with you. Empathy is I'm feeling as you or inside you.
Mm-hmm.
So mechanically, I'm saying mechanically, like what is actually physically happening when you are feeling sympathetic or you are in a state of sympathy with someone is, as you said, you are having an emotional response from your perspective that is sort of in parallel to what you anticipate that they are feeling. Like, let's say I'm just gonna make up a real world example for this sympathy thing. So let's say you have a neighbor who's been married to her husband for 60 years, and he passes away, and you feel loss, you feel sympathy, you feel compassion for her loss, the loss of her husband. And you actually maybe haven't physically been in her presence. Maybe you saw the obituary in the paper, the old-fashioned newspaper, or maybe it came across Facebook. But, they were together for so long, and she must be feeling a loss, sympathy. But what if the truth of the situation was he was emotionally abusive to her the whole time, and what she's actually feeling is relief and freedom from his transition? So in this way, the sympathy that you felt is actually not the truth of her emotional state. And so in this way, you can clearly differentiate if you were in a state of empathy, emotional empathy, you would probably feel her joy at the release of the emotional abuse that she'd endured all those 60 years. Is that a fair expression of an idea, just to paint a picture of... So sympathy is colored by your own memory, your own mental structures, your own emotional state in a moment, your own what you perceive to be social expectations, like I'm supposed to feel a certain way when someone dies. Whereas if you are truly in a state of empathy, there's less differentiation between you and them.
There is less differentiation. And this is where, I guess I'd say this is where it feels like it's important for us to really explore and discuss, because this is where I think it starts bleeding into so many different aspects of the word and the meaning of that.
Yeah, we're really talking about the phenomenon behind each of these words. Like, the words represent something that's happening. And so we're really inviting ourselves in our conversation to get into the substance behind the words. As we've said in so many of our previous conversations, like, language is a big challenge in conversations like these. It's like we have words so that we can relate to one another. What's the substance behind these words?
I'll just put this little tidbit of information out there without going into depth, but there are several schools of thought and theories and philosophies that whether you extend sympathy or empathy to someone else in the case of an unfortunate situation, really has to do with your own blueprint. So in other words, when you're looking at any of these different languages or systems that help you better understand yourself and your blueprint. Now, when I say blueprint, I do mean that as a very generalized, because there's so many ways to understand that and look at that. But some of the schools of thought out there are that if you have this particular blueprint and these are your more predominant characteristics, then you're going to extend sympathy. In other words, you're going to always look at it from your own individual perspective as your primary, but it doesn't mean you can't also come in and have empathy. Whereas if you have this other set of characteristics as your predominant, then you're going to come at it from a perspective of empathy first and then bring in sympathy. And without really going into any depth of that and unpacking that specifically, I do feel a lot of resonance with that. And I think that's why I thought it might be important just to at least look at the etymology and the definitions of them, because that is also going to be perceived differently from different individuals based off of their blueprint and their makeup. So growing up, maybe I would say, oh, I sympathize with you, when honestly, I was empathizing with them. I did not necessarily understand the difference at one point in my life, because that's what I would hear other people say. My deepest sympathies, I sympathize with you. I really did not recognize that what I was doing was really having empathy. Yeah.
So, and I'm hearing you, and I want to, if we can take it back to the analogy that I presented, the neighbor and her husband. So, like when you came into your neighbor's physical presence, in your case, you probably were resonating, you would resonate with the truth of her emotional state. If you are feeling with her as you, that really relates to your preconceived ideas, your past experiences, your programming, your memory of how emotional situations are supposed to be. Like, we all pick up programming along the way, and that's going to color how you feel with her, is what you're saying. And we're going back to that original definition. Feeling with her, but as you, or from your perspective. And that may or may not be the truth of her emotional state. But if you are in a situation where you are empathizing, then you're really out of the picture. I think maybe that's the point I really wanted to get at. Your emotional situation, your mental structures, your opinions, your biases, your memory is not coloring or clouding what you experience with her. So that you're experiencing it, it's like your consciousness is less individuated and more unified. Because you are less identified with your own perception, your own memory, your own emotional state, your own biases, and more identified with her situation, but also just the field in general. I think we have to go deep with this conversation. We have to get into like the definitions of these things at a fundamental, like, spiritual level.
I'm going to bring in something that for a long time I have said, and I've heard other people say that work with this type of energy and concepts and consciousness expansion, etc. say, and then let's revisit that. To be empathetic towards someone is me expressing an emotion towards their circumstances. In other words, there's even a consciousness aspect of it. Just as consciously I would say, I sympathize with you, I'm going to consciously say, wow, I empathize with you in your situation. To be an empath, which is the derivative of the word, on one hand, I would say means something completely, totally different. At quick look at it, it would have nothing to do with me extending empathy. But as we further go into this conversation and go deeper, I think we can come to a place of really correlating the two. Obviously, it's a derivative, of the same, it has the etymology of empath. But to be an empath, when I am talking with others and whether I'm expressing it about myself or them, to be an empath and the experience of living as an empath is very different than me making the conscious choice to extend empathy.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by extend empathy and how that's different from sympathy.
In other words, to me, when I define sympathy and empathy, it is as an action verb, if you will. Okay, so you gave the example of the neighbor, and based off, this is my experience, and this is what has been truth for me in my experience, at least in my conscious awareness, I will say. If I have a certain blueprint, I'm immediately going to go to sympathy. Oh, I feel this, I feel that, I feel this, I feel that. That's just devastating for her. I want to do everything I can to help her through this situation. If I have a different blueprint, I might immediately go to empathy of, oh, I feel her. I feel all of her emotions, and I really want to extend. It's almost like I'm asking, how would I extend, because I'm putting myself in her shoes, so to speak, how would she best receive me extending compassion and connection? If you're from my understanding, again, and what has, we'll just start by saying, which you probably already know this if you're listening, that I am an empath, and empathy is my primary as far as looking between those two. My blueprint primarily goes to empathy as opposed to sympathy. So I'm not going through the memory, as you said, of, okay, what did that feel like for me, or what would that possibly feel like for me if I was going through that?
Or how should I respond in this situation based on what my culture has taught me to do?
Absolutely.
Those are all layers of that. But I think I'm going to...
So where do we go from here?
Yeah. I think I'm going to challenge... I think anytime you are making a projection from your perspective as an individuated consciousness, you're not in empathy. It's not empathy.
So I'd like to talk, this is why I want to talk about this further, because again, from my perspective, empathy and being an empath are completely two totally different things.
But I'm going to suggest that I follow what you're saying, but I think that's cultural. I think our culture has developed a false definition of extending empathy. It's not true.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Do we think somebody that is not an empath, which we haven't really defined yet, but do we think that somebody who is not an empath can still extend empathy? That seems to be where I think we could really dive into.
I agree. So where I currently am in my intuitive response to your question, there are those of us who incarnate with a proclivity or a tendency toward a more developed empathic function. And there are those of us that incarnate with other proclivities, other aptitudes, other functions more developed. It's not for me as much black and white, like you are an empath or you aren't. It's more, this is a function. Some of us have stronger, more consistent access or a stronger capacity to express the function naturally than others do. But I like the idea that we can learn to become aware of our empathic capacity and cultivate it and strengthen it. So,
yes.
Yeah. You follow that?
Yes.
So, with that in mind, like, what is it and how does it present? And you've said earlier in the conversation that you identify as an empath. And so I think if you're amiable to it, the great next step would be for you to express how that has been manifest in your experience, how you came to be aware of it.
Okay.
Does that feel right?
It feels right.
Yeah.
This will be speaking from personal experience, of course, to answer your question. Or your invitation, actually. It was an invitation. It also has the influence of those I have worked with that are empaths.
And so you've seen the difference in your client work.
Yes, a huge difference. And I realized actually probably 2.5 years ago that, wow, I knew it on some level, but I truly embraced that I am working with empaths. Almost everyone who comes to me in some form or fashion is consciously aware that they are an empath, but don't necessarily always have an understanding of how to navigate that in the world. So I did want to put that in as that personal experience, as well as in observation and journeying with others, is that because that introverted intuition, for example, in my own blueprint as an INFJ in the Myers-Briggs language system, is my primary, the senses, if you will, that I am picking up information from, emotional information, is not through the 5 visceral senses. It is through more what we could call the quantum field, the astral plane, the ethers. And then it comes into me as a physical being. And then the only way my physical body, I don't want to say the only way, the primary way my physical body is receiving that until I have more awareness of what is happening is through my 5 physical senses. So I tend to get extremely overstimulated. So if I already have received something, say, in my mind's eye or my mind's ear or the feeling in my body or in my skin, there are so many ways that can come in. So basically you could take the 5 senses and apply that to the quantum field as well. Then as I am receiving it and processing it, and integrating that into my beingness as physical, as form and formlessness, until I really start developing that and having more of an understanding that, personally, I would experience, and still can to this day, but for quite some time before I understood it, experience extreme overstimulation. Extreme. So while that information's coming in from the quantum field, I am seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting every single thing around me and touching. Like everything is so sensitive to me that I'm distracted with what's coming into me intuitively because I'm just naturally picking up on all of the other stimuli. And so to translate, it's not overly easy to translate and articulate. In other words, I've not sat down and wrote a whole chapter about it that I could just, regurgitate. It's more of an experience, but I have taught programs and so forth in this. And each time it's basically helping people recognize and understand if they are an empath and how that impacts them individually, rather than me saying, here's a formula. But it does come down to the overstimulation of the senses within the form of me because I'm getting it in a different manner than maybe those around me. So often people around me they can be in an environment where they're receiving all 5 of those senses and it's not bothering them. It's not impacting them in a physical, tactile way, at least not in their conscious awareness. So I don't feel I explained it very well. I think I'm just getting into how do I explain this, but that feels like it would open up some conversation.
Definitely. And this came up in our conversation before we hit record. And so I have the benefit of having you had explained that the first time, and now I'm hearing it again. And so I may be able to re-articulate in a way that will stimulate an evolution of this. Because one thing that I didn't ask you when I heard you explain it before the record that I'm now going to ask you is, so what you may have just said is that you are receiving layers of information from the field, and it feels like it's being manifest in your body as sense perceptions.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. So it's not sensual information only. Like, let's say you're in an environment with bright lights, music, and strong smells. Those are actual, it's energy in the environment that you're perceiving with what we understand our senses to be. And you're aware, oh, I just smelled the Indian food wafting through, and these bright lights are flashing. Those are sense perceptions. But in addition to that, the energy of the environment, and maybe I'll say the emotional energy of the environment, is also being perceived to you, through you. And before you understood the phenomenon as well as you have come to understand it now, in your body, it felt like a heightened level of sensory stimulation through what we know our senses to be. It was manifest as more pain, physical pain, strong sounds, images. Like, there's a sort of synesthetic quality to that. But basically, you were receiving information from the field, and it was manifesting as a heightened sensitivity and sense perception in your physical body.
Yes. And that helps me say why it feels like it's overstimulating. And I don't mean I'm going to scientifically explain it. What I mean is it is a distraction to the information coming into me intuitively. So when the sensory is going on around me and I am already receiving it in a different manner, it can put my nervous system in overdrive.
Yeah.
And I have worked with many empaths who, when I articulate it that way, they understand what I'm saying. It's an overdrive of the nervous system because your predominant way of receiving that is being interrupted, so to speak. You're perceiving that as an interruption because it is very distracting.
Yeah.
Yes, that feels like something that was important to bring in. It's not to say that I am judging that the sensory is bad. It's not. It's something that I think we all can say how wonderful it is sometimes to have that visceral, physical sense work through us and to observe it and to experience it. As an empath and working with empaths, it is more a learning, a way to honor what you're receiving through your primary faculties as that blueprint, if you will, as that makeup, and not dishonor it, because it's so easy when there's all the stimuli around you to just, it really is easy to just say, okay, and I'm just going to quote myself. I've actually said this quietly, silently, I should say, and out loud. I can't receive this information right now because I can't deal with it with all the stimuli going on.
Yeah.
And what happens is I really just lost an aspect of myself in that moment of that I could have really honored and received some absolute total clarity, but I shut it out because I could not decipher between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to speak a little bit to how I relate to what you've explained, which is that I would consider myself to be highly sensitive to sense perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very acutely aware of, especially sound in my field. Lights. I was explaining to Terri, like, I'm still not comfortable sitting here and being physically comfortable in my body with these lights shining in my face, just so that we can get a halfway decent recording. Mm-hmm. So it's taken me some time to get more comfortable, and it'll take me a little bit longer before it's not something I'm acutely aware of, but especially sounds. Smells are not as big of a deal for me, but it is like I can smell a rat, you know. So there on one level we're speaking to HSP, which is a phenomenon, highly sensitive people, where you're simply very aware of sensory stimulation in your environment. But there's another layer with you, Terri, which is, and I'm going to say, let's zero in, you are an emotional empath, which means when you are, especially when you're one-on-one with another person, you are feeling their emotion.
Yes. And that is another thing I wanted to address today. So that is an excellent way to lead in a side note, if you will. If I were to be sitting here reading someone's Akashic records, there are many different types of empathy that I could discern if they have that or not. And this is not to say that I'm the only one. You know, we can all do this. But my point is, you mentioned I'm an emotional empath. I am also an empath of many other ways as well. There are many types. So let me just give some examples. So it might ring a bell with somebody. It might click. You can be a physical empath, which is what we were just discussing. That's the 5 senses.
Okay.
Physically, you can empathically be reading that information, that stimuli. Mm-hmm. You can also be, and I'm not saying I'm going to cover them all. I'm just going to give some examples. You can be an emotional empath. You can be an environmental empath, reading the world, the nature. And I mean, that's very broad. It could be nature itself. It could be the world affairs. You could actually be
solar flares.
Solar flares. I shared about my night with the solar flare that hit this morning. We've talked before, the moon cycles, so environmental empath, which could even be broken down to many types. I could also be one which I personally am not, but I could be an environmental empath to the societal environment of what's going on in world affairs, what's going on with politics, what's going on in the government, just to name some examples. But I also can be an animal empath. And I wanted to share this because it's amazing how the ahas people have when they realize it. But you could be an animal empath. You could be a plant empath. You know, you could be the plant lady or the cat lady. You've got all these things in your home because you empathically read their energy. There's crystal or stone empath, the core of the earth and all the layers that make that up. And it goes on and on and on. We don't need to go any further. But I will say when my Akashic records were read, I was given 3 primary that I have. And as she continued to look into my records, this is before I was training and had trained and was doing this, she said, "Oh my gosh, you pretty much are an empath of every one of these." And she said that would explain a lot with you being so overstimulated by so many things, because I am receiving it in more than one way. And I definitely don't say this to make this conversation about me. It's just I can share that as a personal example. And so as a highly sensitive person, there are many things that you can be very sensitive to. Mm-hmm. And to tie back to what you were stating and to the examples given earlier is the neighbor. So I'm seeing what her reaction is. I'm hearing what she's really thinking. I'm feeling it. All of that is coming into me at one time. And to tie back to our previous episode, my responsibility, if you will, that I have chosen to accept is to discern. It is now time for me to discern rather than doing what I used to do and run and hide in the corner and do everything I could to create sensory deprivation. That's basically where I am now, is let me discern. Whereas in the past, until I understood that, and I know there are many others out there that do that, we go into a cave, if you will, and just try to create as much sensory deprivation, energy of deprivation, emotional deprivation to not have to experience that.
Well, if you're quite overstimulated by that situation, it becomes more difficult for you to discern how to respond to her. So you've had to kind of cultivate your capacity to be taking in the ordinary sense perceptions that we all deal with, and then also taking in her emotional situation, and then discerning and remaining focused on how you wish to respond to her in a specific, non-conditioned, non-programmed way. Oh, I came over here to be sympathetic, and she doesn't need that. She's happy and partying, and we're all good. And maybe I'm going to party with her, or maybe I need to go blank out because I've just been overstimulated. But you're making your response to her based upon your empathy you have felt as her.
And that therein lies where I was saying I'm now going to bring it in more like an action verb. Okay, based off of this information, how am I going to respond?
Yeah.
How am I going to express compassion or my condolences to her? And so I feel that that was a really good way to tie it back. I may have had to stammer a little to get there because
it's complex.
It's a process. It's a complex process of receiving. As you do it, it becomes very developed. Becomes more. Let me reframe that. It becomes more developed, and then more developed, and then more developed.
It's like everything in life with
just
more
like
experience.
muscle memory.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I can play out the scenario a little bit further from my perspective. If I were in the situation, knock, 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 open the door. Oh, she's not sad. She's partying. This is different from my preconceived notions, my projections, my prescriptions. It's not fitting the mold of my conditioning, what I would expect for this to be like. So I'm going to be here and be aware enough that I'm clean, and I'm clean enough in myself that I'm witnessing what's actually going on in front of me. And then I might say, well, I came over to check on you, but you really feel okay to me. Is that true? Ask her.
Yeah.
Are you okay? How are you doing? You feel good to me. And then let her respond. And if she responds and says that she is, but it doesn't feel like she's actually, that's true, because you have to deal with the other person's biases, preconceived ideas, conditioning. So when you receive the response, it may actually feel like deep down inside, she is really in a bad place and she's only partying to put on a show so that people think she's okay. So there's another layer of discernment in her response that you can feel. But again, not if you're going into it with your own biases, with your own preconceived notions. So empathically allow her to respond and receive as her, and then respond again. So it's this very alive, dynamic process. And that takes us back to like what I was suggesting earlier. We have a cultural definition. There's a buzzword in our culture about empathy, but I don't think that we are using the word correctly culturally. I think sympathy can be a beautiful thing.
Yes.
Compassion is a beautiful and wonderful thing. And we talked about last time, it is actually the outpicturing or the byproduct of being in the field of love. If you're in the field of love, if you are tuned in to the frequency of love, it becomes you. And then you outpicture as compassion,
Yes.
as sympathy for all of your fellow men. But empathy, to me, is when you are beyond you. You are in a space, you are identified with the aspect of us that is beyond individual identification, so that you are actually inside the energy of the other person.
Yes. And that raises a question for me for clarification. I've heard a couple of times that you have talked about sympathy as compassion. I think that is absolutely beautiful. And I think it's important to point it out so that no one thinks that I am saying that empathy is good and sympathy is bad. Not at all. I think it's beautiful. So whatever way your blueprint chooses, I'm not even going to say chooses, the way your blueprint navigates through the inherent you-ness, who you are and how you express that, I think is beautiful. The question is, when I talked about extending empathy, we wrapped it back up for me to come back to say that is where I've made the choice based off all the information coming in and how I discern to share that. Is that also compassion, or is that something different?
Oh, great. Yeah. I think that you have the choice in your response.
Mm-hmm.
After your inner discernment, your choice of response. And the choice could be, I'm going to rise into the frequency of love, and compassion will be outpictured.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to say, so let's say I'm not very empathic. This is purely speculative. If I'm not very empathic, I do still need to, I have a choice I may make. I'm not going to say need to. That was also part of our pre-production conversation. If I am not empathic, and I have had the courage and the willingness to identify that I'm not empathic, there is a choice I may make still, which is, in that knowing, I may choose to at least suspend my prescriptions and my projections and my biases and my opinions and my expectations. I may choose at least to suspend those aspects of myself, so that I'm not going into an interaction with another person and adding all of that onto the interaction, because it becomes film on the glass. It becomes dirt it becomes like a filter in between me and them.
An influence.
That precludes me from really connecting to them. So even if I'm not empathic, and I don't know how to do that very well. I'm not emotional. I don't know, people say, I don't really know about this emotional stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm not an empath, but you can become aware of your opinions, your biases, your prescriptions, your prejudices, your expectations. Like, you can become aware of those things so that when you are interacting with another, you are interacting cleanly. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to suggest this is a step on the path toward becoming more empathic.
The way Jared was speaking to that was bringing up, if, say I were to have this conversation with somebody related to that, it felt like asking that question along the lines of, okay, if you don't connect to empathy, being an empath, I'll put it that way. If you are not an empath or you don't connect to receiving information that way, as you were saying, if I were to only extend sympathy based off of how I would feel about it, I would potentially be influencing that energy, if you will, onto them. Oh, well, you should not be dancing and celebrating. You should be mourning with the black veil on, right?
100% projection.
Yes. So that is, I'm just trying to make this like really simplified with what you were saying, because what you said is just beautiful. Because, so yes, we can make those choices of, okay, I don't really want to influence her and make her feel like she should not be celebrating. That's her choice and her emotion and her experience.
Yeah.
As an empath, if you will, or a highly sensitive person that we were talking about, I have already felt what she's really feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I then can make that choice. Oh, do I want to celebrate with her? Do I want to just give her time and space to celebrate in her own way? But I don't necessarily choose to indicate how she should be responding. So that word should was trying to tie to what you were saying. I think that's where I was going.
Yeah. And you are reinforcing and reiterating when I used words like projection and opinion and bias, like those are all the different ways that you could come into that situation unclean.
Yeah.
In your perception that could and you've introduced another dynamic to it, which is that people then have to feel guilty about the way they feel based on the energy you brought that wasn't there to begin with. So part of this empathy is getting all of your personal stuff out of the way so that you are being as the other person. And I've had these situations, and this can be at so many different levels. Like, okay, here's a kind of really simple, basic example. Let's say a guy like me shows up at a kickboxing studio, karate dojo, and I'm going to be taking karate lessons with the group, okay? So there's a certain physicality to me that people perceive. I'm kind of thick and brawny, like, I don't know.
Strong, muscular.
Yeah. So they receive me in that based on an initial perception, and they start to develop a mental idea of who they're experiencing now for the first time. They assume that I'm really masculine, really outdoorsy, really strong. And because I'm fairly reserved, at least initially in my emotional expression when first meeting people, all of that's going to be reinforced. So they're painting this picture and developing a bias. And what that does is it precludes them from knowing the more emotional, feminine, creative, intuitive, softer aspects of who I am. And so as we're moving through every interaction, regardless of whether or not you even identify with the word empathy or with being an empath, as I said, some work we can all do is to just clean out our own minds, our own emotional systems, so that we move into interactions with less and less bias.
This conversation, as we said, can connect to so many things, but a word that popped in when you were saying that is, you know, the social stereotypes. That's, again, it's formulating.
It's conditioning.
Yeah, it is conditioned. Yes. Those cultural suggestions that led us to that. Yes, I like you using the word very clean. It's tying it back to previous episodes. Another way we said it is being responsible for your own energy and not necessarily, like you said, projecting or putting that on to someone else. You know, even if you're not one who identifies as a highly sensitive person or an empath, and you show up at that door and you're shocked by her behavior, which is understandably so, regardless of your blueprint. You know, if you're shocked by that, you can be shocked by that. You can still extend sympathy, and then you can move on your way rather than, oh my gosh, you know, having the shock factor.
You know what I would probably do? Because I have gate 22 in my solar plexus defined, and that's grace and graciousness. Mm-hmm. I'd probably express this shock, and then I would be like, I'm so sorry I reacted that way, but this wasn't what I was expecting. I came over to offer my condolences because I had a preconceived idea about how I was going to find you, and this is not that. Mm-hmm. You seem great.
Yeah.
Is that true? How are you doing? Are you okay? So it would be like I would as much as possible be transparent with that.
I would just join the party.
Yeah. And in some cases, that might be the next step for me is pour me a martini. Let's do this.
Wow. I feel her energy, and it would inspire me and excite me to celebrate with her. If it were appropriate in the situation, she might want her own time. But I think it is good to share those examples of how would that move us, and how would we navigate that, because it is a shock factor compared to those cultural suggestions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And a word that's coming to mind that I think is reinforcing the direction this conversation has gone is to become innocent. As we become more and more innocent, then we can see with our clean eyes, and then you're allowing those that you interact with to teach you who they are and show you where they are without your bias. And so speaking to what Terri was suggesting earlier about the different ways that phenomena like empathy can be manifest in your blueprint and your design, and I'm going to speak through the human design system because it's one that I'm quite familiar with. So in the human design system, you may have a completely open emotional solar plexus center.
Do we know someone like that?
We know someone like that.
That would be me.
That would be Terri. And so what that means is she is receiving and then amplifying the emotional information that she's getting from the field. Far fewer of her emotional situations are actually hers. Mm-hmm. So one thing that she may ask herself at times is, I'm feeling frustrated. Is that mine? Mm-hmm. And in many cases, you realize it's not mine. It's Tim's, or it's this colleague's, or whoever.
Discernment.
Yes, discerning. That's an aspect, part of your discernment. I, on the other hand, have a defined emotional solar plexus. So I'm less susceptible to other people's emotional states. I'm more of an emitter of emotional frequencies. And the emotional frequencies that I emit are grace and compassion, the 22 and the 36. I also have some other particular gates defined in my body graph, like the gate 50, which is about harmony and values, the gate 19, which is about sensitivity to needs, and I have the gate 13, which in the human design system is called the gate of the listener. In the gene key synthesis, it is the gate of empathy. What this gate represents is listening, actually listening is not the right word. It's hearing. It's hearing the frequency of the situation, like beyond the words. It's the like hearing into the field. Mm-hmm. So what I perceive is when I am in a situation where there is agitation or unease between people, I hear the frequency of the agitation, and I can feel a biophysical response to it. And I have to bring it back into harmony, because that's how I'm designed. You see, it's just a subtle difference. Like I'm not open in my emotional solar plexus, but I'm hearing frequencies, and this is a form of clairaudience. Mm-hmm. And then these other gates that I have activated in that system are bringing certain dynamics into the conversation for how I process it and then how I respond. So the important thing is to just become aware of how you operate so that you know, and then you discern for yourself how you want to be that, to employ those faculties to move through your life. Another empathic mode that I don't think you verbalized, that I think is maybe true for you, but is definitely true for a lot of people, is medically intuitive. Yeah. Like you're feeling someone's physical ailment.
Yes.
And in human design system, that if you have an open splenic center, because that has to do with the immune system and those kinds of things. So if your splenic center is open, you may have the potential to develop your medical empathy. I don't have that open. Mine is like almost completely full, firing on all cylinders. So
yeah, it's like when the first time I really came to understand that, and I kept having a headache around a certain individual. And, they could tell by my reaction. I'd kind of grab my head and, gosh, that was sudden. And she was had worked with energy and been an energy healer and all that. And she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry that you're feeling my headache every time I'm in your presence." And she said, "I have cluster headaches and migraines." And I was like, oh my, so you have these experiences and exposure where you realize how you're receiving.
Yeah.
And I wanted to add something so that I don't forget something else. And it's not that we have to discuss it in great detail, but one of the other types of empaths I forgot to mention, and I don't know what it's actually called, to be honest, I'd have to go back and review that. But I just call it a cognitive empath. There are those who can feel other people's thoughts.
Okay.
And I know that you can discuss this. Yeah. So it wanted to be brought up. We don't want to eliminate that from the conversation or from the individuals listening.
So in the human design system, your head center and your ajna. So the head center is slightly above your skull in this system. Mm-hmm. And some people may say there's a crown chakra and a head chakra. Mm-hmm. So, but these words can get us trapped. But the idea is that if your head is open, you're open-minded, basically, you're receiving, like going back to what you said about receiving from the field, think about the concept that you don't have ideas. Like, oh, I have an idea. No. That's actually not how it works. I've just received an idea.
From the collective? or the field?
From whatever you're aligned to.
Okay.
So, for instance, I'm gonna ground this in a particular way. It's a spiritual concept, but it can be so grounded and real. So let's say in my work as a designer, as an architect, let's say I'm designing a house, a single family residence, and I'm tuning into the frequencies of Frank Lloyd Wright and John Lautner and Richard Neutra. These are the great mid-century architects. What is keeping you from conceiving, believing, knowing, conceptualizing, thinking that when I have an aha moment in the design of that project, that the thing that's actually happening isn't that the non-physical energy of these men that have passed away, that are now in the field, that I'm not actually connecting with their consciousness and realizing and articulating an idea as a result of that cognitive connection that I'm making. So what I may be actually doing is looking at my Pinterest feed, reviewing their work, or pulling a book off my shelf here and looking again at their work, and I'm tuning into them as a frequency. And then the idea is realized and received, and it feels like that. Like when you hear about artists and creatives that are talking about, it felt like I wasn't doing anything. It was doing me.
Yeah.
Like that is the receiving of inspiration by virtue of your tuning into the frequency of those people. And it's the same with spiritual, I'm doing quotation marks, spiritual masters. If you are in the frequency of Jesus Christ, you are resonant with the teaching that became him, then you're tuning into that frequency and it is becoming you. You see, this goes back to like when I was saying, like, it's less you looking at yourself as an individuated, separate thing with regards to this empathy and openness, because what we're really getting at here is different people are open in different ways. Cognitively open, medically open, emotionally open. But through your openness and through your tuning to particular ideas and frequencies, I mean, it can be said that everything in creation is an idea in the mind of the universe. It's all just ideas in the mind of the universe. And we are receivers. We're all designed to receive in particular ways. I could just talk about this stuff all day long. It's time for me to pass the mic and let you.
No, it's good because I'm deducing to make the statement that tying back to empathically picking up in these different ways, it is all a connection to frequencies.
Thank you.
Vibrations and frequencies. And we are feeling the vibrations and the order or the way or ways that they come in still bring you all back to, it's a way of empathy.
Yeah.
It's feeling the vibrations.
Yeah. Everything is energy.
Yes.
And each of us, see, when we speak to blueprint or human design or essence or, whatever words we use to describe the phenomena, basically, at the moment of your conception, and then at the moment of your birth, and in human design system, at the moment 3 months or 88 degrees before the moment of your birth, your consciousness is coming into physical form. And according to the energy of the cosmos in relationship to that specific spot where you came into the meat, you know, the intelligence of the universe with you, your higher self, your source self, decided that this was going to be the spot that would engender the right combination of energies to program a specific vessel, and for your consciousness to come into that vessel with particular strengths, proclivities, aptitudes, gifts, shadows, tendencies, patterns. Like you all kind of, it's like, I'm going to go in and explore these themes. And in order to explore these themes, I need to be born under these stars, and I need these parents that are going to teach me this stuff. And so you come in with that. And then during the course of lifetime, you're participating in the amendment of what you started with. You're either ignoring it, suppressing it, denying it, or owning it, or cultivating it, or expanding it, or, you know, whatever you decide to do. There's no judgment of any of this. But I think from my perspective, for why Terri and I are wanting to have these conversations and kind of develop a community around these kinds of conversations, is that one of the pleasures of a lifetime is for you to explore the specifics of the beauty of what you've come with and how you're made, so that you know, so that you're empowered, right? And most of us, like, I have felt this way in my past. Like, I don't know how to work this thing.
Yeah.
Like, your life can have an instruction manual, and you're the one that has to write it.
Yes. Absolutely. And as we've talked about before, the very simple concept that Abraham speaks through Esther Hicks is, if you don't know how are you going to know what you want if you don't know what you don't want? That's how you write it.
Yeah.
You have the experiences.
And that is one of the most beautiful aspects of the construct that we have agreed to experience here. Contrast in this way is a part of this reality. Mm-hmm. Embrace it. Play with it. Learn from it. Be wholly invested in it.
Yes. So I heard yesterday that love is the presence. This is how I interpreted what I heard. Put it that way. Love is the presence of all emotions.
The way I would say what I heard you say, in a way that resonates with me and makes sense to me, based on where I currently stand, is that I would say love is the action of the Creator. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't exclude.
No, it does not.
So everything is included.
Everything is included, and that's important for us to remember.
Yeah.
And what I feel empathically, intuitively, that he was saying is that when in the energy of love, all is.
Yes, you are.
It's not exclusive, as what you just said. It doesn't exclude.
Yeah.
So excluding certain experiences, emotions, anything like that is not extending to yourself love.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's going to be hard for a lot of people to swallow, but.
And being a highly sensitive person, and for those who are listening that are or identify with that based off your experience or this conversation or all of the above or whatever, maybe this will be a future topic, but there's a lot of there has been a lot of programming, cultural suggestions, as Jared says, around shutting yourself out, excluding interaction with the world because of how much you feel or how much you sense or how much you experience. I say sense. Let me take that word out based off previous conversation that could confuse it. Based off what you intuit. Let me use that word. Based off what you're intuiting. And so that ties back to what I was just saying, and what I feel Jared was saying is we don't exclude. It is all love, and having the experiences and moving into the energy of using discernment, as well as you were talking about that being pure. Clean. I was trying to think of the word you used, being clean within
pure
yourself.
Pure is a good word too, but yeah.
Pure, clean. And that doesn't mean here's a set of standards that you need to follow. Here's a set of rules that you need to follow to identify you as worthy or as clean or pure. It's just authentic, being in the authenticity of each experience, the energies, the frequencies, the vibrations, the emotions.
Yeah, and anytime you hear someone refer to the concept of shadow work or becoming aware of your shadows, that is a way of understanding a cleaning process. It's not the only way to go about taking care of that, but basically ease yourself into taking an inventory of any of those biases or opinions or traumas or cultural biases or conditionings or mental structures or belief structures, any of those things that cloud the lens. So it requires tremendous delicateness with yourself. There's some courage involved in it. And the reality is, even those who don't ever embark on a specific process or even on a spiritual journey, like a lot of this happens in the course of living. Like life is going to present us with opportunities to clear those things out because that's part of the construct. It's the point. But becoming more conscious and aware of the process can be a beautiful thing. And that's the path I've chosen. Or maybe the path chose me. But, so do we feel like there's anything left that we need to uncover with regards to empathy? I have a good parting message in mind.
That sounds wonderful.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And it's basically the same message. And maybe it's an invitation, a challenge. If you like challenges, receive it as a challenge. If you like subtle invitations, you can take it as that. But going forward from hearing this or being a part of this transmission, going forward, consider taking an inventory of all that specific stuff that's yours that you're carrying around that may cloud your lenses, that may skew your perception, that may prohibit you from really connecting with another human being, whether it be your opinions, your belief structures, your biases, your emotional traumas, your baggage. Give yourself permission to lightly consider those things. Don't take this too seriously, but when you notice one, just say, "Thank you. I've received the teaching. Thank you. I've received the teaching." And then you can let that go. And you may feel like you're lightening up. You may feel flushes of hot and cold in your body. Sometimes you may feel moments of physical discomfort as some of these things get released. But just be patient with yourself through all of that. And then see how your relationships may change.
Beautiful.
Okay. We'll leave it there. Thank you all for joining us for this one. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.